Press 1 to start. Okay, 3 more exam questions, 3 groups, so 36 questions here. RF hazards, ionizing radiation. High energy particles or electromagnetic waves capable of causing cell damage and DNA changes. Overexposure can be deadly, okay? For the most part, in amateur radio, you're not really going to have that much risk of going over. If you're sticking to the, like most HF radios are 100 watts. Now, there are some that are 20 or 10, and some that are 5, but you're not going to go into an overexposure situation with 5, 10, 20, or 100 watts. I'm pretty sure that you couldn't overexpose even running digital, where, you know, with digital, you're probably running a 40 or 50% duty cycle. So you're probably still not going to go over on the exposure. But it is your responsibility as a amateur radio licensee that you're going to take the time to measure out all your, well, I won't say measure. There's a calculation sheet. You can get it off the FCC. You can get it off ARRL. There's a calculation sheet. You go over the bands that you transmit. It's going to ask you your duty cycle. Make you know, if you're running digital, you're going to have a higher duty cycle. If you're just doing single sideband, your duty cycle is probably going to be pretty low. But you have to calculate your exposure, and you have to calculate your neighbor's exposure. Your neighbors, they've got a name for it, and we'll come up to that here in a minute. But you have to make sure that you're not inadvertently overexposing your neighbor to RF radiation. The worst RF radiation in amateur radio is going to be, I think it's a 6-meter band. I think is what they've determined is probably the worst. I think that's coming up here though, so let's wait until we get there. Non-ionizing radiation, lower energy radio frequency waves that can cause heating of tissue, not enough energy to cause DNA damage or chemical changes in cells. Overexposure can be a health hazard. So ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. Ionizing can be deadly. Non-ionizing can be a health hazard. What type of radiation are radio signals? Non-ionizing radiation. Thank you very much. How does RF radiation differ from ionizing radiation? RF radiation is perfectly safe. Chemical changes in cells. Yep. RF radiation does not have sufficient energy to cause chemical changes in cells and cause damage, but it is still how did they word it there? A health hazard? Yeah, worded it as a health hazard. Overexposure can be a health hazard, but for the most part, you're not going to get overexposed with most of this. To ensure safety, the FCC has set exposure limits. The station licensee, which will be you, is responsible to ensure no one is exposed beyond these limits. And there are separate limits set for you and for your neighbor. 3 ways to determine compliance is by running the calculations based on the FCC OET Bulletin 65, found on the FCC website, which I've already pointed out is not the easiest website to navigate. By calculation based on computer modeling or by measurement of field strength. Now, field strength equipment is difficult to come by these days, so you're probably using one of the first 2. Oh, and it also has to be calibrated, so you'd have to send it to the Cal Lab and have it calibrated. So you're probably best off using one of the first 2 options, and that I'm pretty sure that FCC bulletin is available on ARRL. And I know I told you we're going to start promoting the club a little bit, and that's our choice. But ARRL, in order to have our class listed on their website, we have to promote them. And it's good, you know, they're like, they're the regulatory watchdogs for this. And there's a couple of bands that we're in danger of losing that they're working on right now. And there's probably another one right behind it. Who is responsible for ensuring that no person is exposed to RF energy above the FCC exposure limits? Bravo, the station licensee. Which of the following is an acceptable method to determine whether your station complies with FCC RF exposure limits? Yep, Delta. Radiation exposure. One factor of RF exposure evaluation is duty cycle. Okay, and the duty cycle, unless you have some tool monitoring your duty cycle will be the amount of time that you're transmitting versus the amount of time that you're receiving, because you can't do both at once. That's what your duty cycle is. And that's why I say if you're running digital, you're probably going to be pretty close to a 50%, maybe a little below it, duty cycle. That will also make your radio hot. That will make your antenna hot. That will make your coax hot, you know, running all that the whole time. But you can be up to 50% duty cycle. If you're running single sideband, when I sit and run single sideband, I don't really jaw all the time. I'm not going back and forth. I had one conversation with one ham in Detroit that lasted about 40 minutes, but he was the talker. I was the listener. He was telling me of the evils of the Chinese radios. So, and then he asked me, so which radio are you using? I said, oh, I'm using a Xiegu. He said, I've never heard of that. I said, oh, it's probably the best radio to come out of China so far. But he said, well, I hope it works for you. And I said, well, it is right now. But he was a nice guy. The guy's name is Dave. He's like 83 or 84 years old. So I pretty much expected what he told me. And, but anyway, duty cycle is defined as a percentage of time a transmitter is transmitting. Duty cycle affects a person's average exposure. And this is probably the biggest factor of your exposure is how much time you're actually transmitting. Well, I won't say biggest, but it is probably the one that you're going to be able to control the most. Your proximity to the antenna is going to be a factor. Your the amount of power you're transmitting, the frequency you're transmitting, all those things are factors, and the worksheets will figure all that out for you. You just plug in the values. Allowable RF power density is inversely proportional to duty cycle. So a 50% duty cycle allows 2 times the power density. If you're only if your duty cycle is 25%, you're allowed 4 times the power density. What is the definition of duty cycle during the average time for RF exposure? During the averaging time. Okay. Charlie, the percentage of time the transmitter is transmitting, and that should all be read there, not just part of it. Why is duty cycle one of the factors used to determine safe RF radiation exposure levels? Alpha, it affects the average exposure to radiation. How does the allowable power density for RF safety, let me start that over again. How does the allowable power density for RF safety change if the duty cycle changes from 100% to 50%? Charlie, it increases by a factor of 2. And I've never seen anybody that has a 100, well, who has, let me ask you this, who has a 100% duty cycle? CW if we hold the key down. Yeah, I can't think of any two-way communications that has 100% duty cycle. That would only be like a commercial radio station, broadcast radio station. So, because you're transmitting full time, there's, yeah, maybe I should hold the joke on that one. What's that? There you go. Okay, so it increases by a factor of 2 if you drop from 100% to 50%. So you're, okay, the human body absorbs more RF energy at some frequencies than others. Remember, I touched on this just a minute ago. Exposure limits are different for each amateur radio band. The 50 megahertz band, which is the 6-meter band, is the frequency at which a human body absorbs the most radiation. Going lower or higher from there, within reason, it drops. Factors that affect exposure: frequency and power level of the field, distance from the antenna to a person, and radiation pattern of the antenna. The radiation pattern, remember, we talked about the antennas, and I had the Yagi antenna here. That most of the power is going forward on that one when you transmit. So that will have an effect on it as well. And here is your, okay, so what this shows is what the limits are, okay, for the, and let's see, at the bottom we have frequency on the vertical. There we have power density. And the lines that you see here represent two different things. You see the controlled limit, okay, and this is the limit for you and those in your household that know that you're transmitting. But your neighbor, this is their limit right here. So their limits are less, and they should be getting less exposure because they're next door, and they should stay there. So actually, I've got several really decent neighbors, but I've also got some that don't think I belong in the neighborhood. Does everybody know where the Sheriff's Training Center is? There on, you know, you see it from the freeway. I live 2 blocks north of there. So, yeah. Well, I mean, you know, my wife is black, so, and she wanted to have some friends, some neighbors that she could talk to during the day when I go to work and have coffee with. We've been there for 7.5 years. I'm friends with all the neighbors. I've shared beers with them and everything. She only talks to one of them and doesn't talk to her a lot. So, but yeah, I told my friend at work, oh, never mind, I should leave that one alone. But anyway, so that gives you an example of the limits. Why do exposure limits vary with frequency? Delta, the human body absorbs more RF energy at some frequencies than others. Very good. At which of the following frequencies does maximum permissible exposure have the lowest value? Sorry? Bravo, 50 megahertz. That is the, and which band did I say that was? 6 meters. I think 6 meters is 50 to 54 megahertz, I'm pretty sure. Oh, let's see. 6 meters, 50 to 54. And 50 to 50.1 is CW only. Yeah. Almost every band has CW. So areas of the band where it's recommended that you only operate CW. What factors affect the RF exposure of people near an amateur station antenna? What factors affect RF exposure of people near an amateur station antenna? Okay. delta. So that would be frequency and power level of the RF field, distance from the antenna to the person, and radiation pattern of the antenna. Delta sounds like a good answer. You should regularly evaluate your station's safety. Reevaluate whenever the transmitter or antenna is changed, or whenever you add something new, you had to calculate, make the calculations for that. If evaluation shows excessive exposure, you should either relocate the antenna, lower the transmit power, or lower the duty cycle. Since most people's antenna is probably locked down to a certain location due to available space, lowering your transmit power or lowering your duty cycle probably where you get the most bang for your buck as far as getting underneath the limits. But like I said, it's not likely that you're going to go over the limit with a 100-watt radio. I mean, if you buy a power amp, then maybe you'll have something to consider. Which of the following actions can, regardless of what I just said, you're still responsible for measuring, making all those calculations, printing them off, and if the FCC comes and knocks on your door and says, we want to inspect your station, they're going to want to see that, along with what you're sitting in this class for, which is your license. They're going to want to see all that. I've never heard of that happening, but there's provision set aside for them to be able to do that if they want. Which of the following actions can reduce exposure to RF radiation? Alpha. What'd you say, Mike? Alpha? Everybody agree with alpha? That is a good one. They tried to trick you up on that one too. So relocate the antennas. Relocating the transmitter really doesn't do much except for it changes your distance from the antenna. Doesn't change anybody else's distance from the antenna. Increasing the duty cycle definitely goes away from it. How can you make sure that your station stays in compliance with RF safety regulations? Bravo. By reevaluating the station whenever an item in the transmitter or antenna system is changed. That's a very good answer. You see that there's always a question or two on every test where one of the wrong distractors says by informing the FCC. Never inform the FCC of anything. There's actually a local, well, let me go ahead and finish this. Ionizing radiation, ultraviolet light and higher frequencies. Radio signals are not ionizing radiation. Insufficient energy to cause changes to cells and DNA. Exposure limits. Station licensee is responsible for ensuring no person is exposed beyond the limits. Exposure limit determinations. You can either use the Bulletin 65. You can use computer modeling calculations. You can measure field strength if you're lucky enough to be able to find a field strength meter that's reasonably priced and can be calibrated. Duty cycle is percentage of time transmitting. Duty cycle is a percentage of time the transmitter is transmitting. I keep wanting to say it's transmitting to not transmitting. Affects the average exposure to radiation. Duty cycle is probably the easiest thing to control. Radiation exposure, frequency dependent. Body absorbs more RF energy at some frequencies than others. Maximum permissible exposure is lowest between 30 and 300, which is all of your HF spectrum. That is VHF spectrum. Maximum exposure, maximum permissible exposure is lowest. Okay, remember that's VHF, and remember that 50 megahertz, 6 meter band is a VHF, right? So that's where your exposure should be the lowest because you can absorb more of that. Frequency and power affect exposure. Distance to antenna affects exposure. Radiation pattern affects exposure. And relocating the antenna can reduce exposure. Reevaluating exposure, or always reevaluate exposure whenever there are changes in your transmitter or antennas.